Hello again, it's Uncle Jeff on March 11th, 2022 with another update on psychic things. As you can see in the background, my carpenter showed up yesterday and finished my Addams Family wall unit, which holds my reading lamp and a shelf for my TV remotes and my phone charger and my drink of juice when I'm watching TV, because I spend a lot of time in that recliner chair. So I'm happy. He still has to varnish the interior part, which he hasn't done, but that will happen on another day. This whole vlog is going to be about all the psychic phenomena that were associated with my being connected with my birth mother, Barbara. So in spring of 1992, I was back in San Diego going to the controversial bookstore again on one of my trips, and I'm leaning down looking at something on a lower shelf, and there's nobody else around me. All of a sudden, this large paperback book falls off the top shelf and hits me on the head. And it's an 8.5 by 11 book that's, maybe about that thick. It wasn't real heavy, so it didn't knock me out, but I picked it up and I looked at it, and it was the Barbara Brennan Healing Techniques book. And she actually teaches a course out in Long Island that takes 2 years to do. You get certified as a healer. So there was a lot of interesting information in there, and I was still at the holistic clinic, so of course I clicked with it, and I thought, well, I guess this means I'm supposed to buy the book. So I took it up to the cashier and I said, this book fell off the shelf on my head. And she said, oh, that means you're supposed to buy it. and she said, that happens occasionally here when people are being pushed in the right direction. And so I looked at her and I said, well, thank goodness you don't sell unabridged dictionaries. And she laughed. So I took it home and I read through it, and I was finding a lot of fascinating things in there about the chakras and the energy layers, the astral body and the causal body and the etheric body, and how you raise your vibration to, effect healings. And then I saw online, or well, it couldn't have been online back then. It must have been in the book. You could get on a mailing list. That she was having an introductory course in San Diego, March 12th to 15th of that year. And so I signed up for it right away and went over by myself, stayed with Rob, and went to the course. It was Thursday through Sunday. And the first 2 days we learned a lot of techniques. There were about 30 or 40 of us in the class in this large auditorium. But they came around and did individual teachings, and then you would pair off into individuals and into pairs and practice. And this middle-aged woman that was my partner for a good share of it had some issues going on. Of course, I didn't know about it, but we would sit there and read each other's auras and feel things with our hands, and then just meditate and think about it. And into my head popped that she needed to get away from some man, and that she was supposed to make a decision, and she was sort of waffling. And as soon as I said that to her, she burst into tears and she said, I'm seriously considering divorcing my husband, and I know I need to make the decision. And she said, you picked up on it, and I'm going to do it. Wow, that's a little severe. I hope the information was right. And when she did things with me, it was less dramatic, because I didn't have so much drama going on in my life. But the next day, on Saturday, we were doing more intense stuff where you lay on the floor on a cushion, and then they would work over you like this. And she was doing stuff on my etheric and astral fields. And one of the instructors was watching from up on the stage and came over and said, excuse me a minute. She said, just keep your eyes closed and keep concentrating on just being level with where you are. She said, your silver cord that's connected to your mother has come loose from your heart, and I'm going to reattach it. And so she says she does that. She does some, woo-woo over my heart. And as she's telling me that, I'm thinking, well, I was adopted, and so my birth mother and I were disconnected, so maybe that's what that is. So then later on the day she came back, she said, I can see that your cord has popped out again, so this time just meditate, have an empty mind, just be neutral, and I'll put it back. And so she did, and by the time we went home that day, I said, am I okay? And she said, oh yeah, I can see it, even though it was nothing I could see. She said, now don't think about this because these things tend to disengage real easily if you start adding a lot of energy to them. So, don't talk about it with your friends. So I said, okay. I go home, I'm telling Rob about, some of the other stuff that happened. And then I just couldn't help myself. I had to tell him about this maternal cord. And he was a skeptic with all of this. And he goes, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. I go back the next day and she says, it's out again. And I had to admit that I, not followed her instruction and told Rob about it. So she once again reconnected me. And that time it stayed. And even by the end of the course, it was still there. And she said, I think it's really solidly connected now. So, it's sort of an interesting thing that went on. Now I'll skip ahead because at this point I don't know my birth mother Barbara or her daughter Devin, Devin's husband Steve, and Barbara's husband Bill. But this same weekend they had left Thousand Oaks, so they lived in California, went to San Francisco where Devin and Steve lived because it was their wedding anniversary on March 16th, which was a Monday. And they were celebrating it on either Saturday or Sunday, having a dinner together. During the dinner, Steve, who is probably the least psychic in the group, but maybe more open to suggestion, suddenly said to Barbara, Jerry is trying to contact you. And, they weren't even talking about, the child that Barbara had years ago at the time, so this was kind of a surprise. Barbara had told Devin when she was a teen, I believe, that she did have a half-brother that was conceived before Barbara married her father. And Devin eventually went into social work and adoptions, and then as the rules changed where you could get more information about a child you gave up for adoption, she started encouraging her mother to try to find me. And Barbara was a little reluctant and thought about it, but then didn't move ahead. But Jerry was the name she had given me, so this really got her to thinking. So Devin encouraged her again, and she sort of thought about it, and she contacted the Children's Home in St. Paul and asked if they could try to find me. And the woman, Connie was her name, said, write your son a letter, and then I'll hold on to it when you're ready for me to do the research to find him, and then send him the letter. I'll do that. So she wrote the letter, but didn't say to go ahead with anything right away. She and her sister Jillian were going on a cruise to Norway that summer. So when they left on the cruise, somewhere June, July in there, Barbara decided to go ahead with it. And so she gave her the high sign, and Connie started researching me. It was pretty easy because during medical school I'd gone to the children's home to read my history so I could find out about any family things. And I couldn't look at the papers, but they read them to me. I told them that my name was no longer Jeffrey Rasmussen. My mom had remarried, and my last name was now Vadheim, and I was in medical school, so they noted that down. When Connie researched me, she found my new name. She knew I was probably a doctor by now. She called the Minnesota Board of Medical Examiners, and indeed I had a license through 1984. And then it was transferred to Arizona. She called the Arizona board, and they said, oh, he's listed. Here's his office number. And, of course, it was the holistic clinic. And so she called the number towards the end of the day. It was about 5 o'clock, and the receptionist came up and said, there's an adoption agency that wants to talk to you. And I said, okay, put them through, as I figured they were calling about one of my patients. And the lady introduced herself, and she kind of talked a little vaguely and tangentially around the subject. And I said, oh, I'm glad to help you with anybody's, any adoption issues that I'm allowed to do, because I was adopted myself, actually, from your same agency. And she says, well, I'm calling about you. Your birth mother wants to connect with you, and she's written you a letter. I said, oh, for sure, send it to me. I gave her my address and phone number. A few days later, the letter came. It was a 2-page letter written by Barbara and a little poem she'd written about the baby she'd given up. So I immediately sat down at the typewriter and wrote this long letter, single-spaced. I don't know, it was many pages, but it was outlining my life up to that point. Included my phone number. I sent it to Connie in St. Paul. She turned around and forwarded it to Barbara, who's now back in Thousand Oaks from the trip. As it turned out, Connie had faxed Barbara during her trip to say that she had found me, and then she was at a hotel in Bergen, Norway, and the fax came in at 3 a.m. and the lady at the front desk, of course, read the fax because you can always see what's on a fax. And she figured it was very important. She went up and knocked on the door and woke them up to give them the news. Your son has been found, like I'd been lost. So we agreed to meet in person at Rob's house in San Diego in September. Devin would come down from San Francisco, pick up Barbara in Thousand Oaks, and they'd drive down to San Diego. And so we got together. I took over my baby book and anything I had, and we had a wonderful meeting, and they were going through the book, looking at my baby pictures, and Barbara was kind of filling me in on the story of how they concealed the pregnancy, and and then I said, well, tell me about my father, because I don't know anything about Jerry, was actually the name of the father. That's why she gave me that name. And she kind of looked sheepishly and she said, well, Jerry isn't really your father. She said, the children's home kept pushing me for the father's name, and I didn't want him to be involved because he was from a prominent Minneapolis family. So my coworker was Jerry, and we had dated a little bit, and when we tried to go further, nothing came of it, and he just couldn't function. And then later he suddenly resigned and left and went somewhere, and we never knew where it was, and he couldn't be contacted, so I figured he'd be good to use. And later she presumed that he was probably gay and had homosexual panic and fled the Twin Cities. So he became my ersatz father for the time being. And I said, well, who is my father? Well, she said his name's Stan. And I said, well, Stan who? She didn't want to give me his last name like, I would know it. I said, how am I going to know him? She said, well, his last name's Hoff. And I said, oh, Hoff Rubber Stamp Company from Minneapolis. And she paled and she goes, how did you know that? And I said, well, when Brent and I were kids, we used to always order rubber stamps from the newspaper office, and they always came from the Hoff Rubber Stamp Company, and it was always printed right on the handle of the stamper. And my mom and dad had rubber stamps in the store for endorsing checks, and they all came from there. And so we knew that was the big place you got rubber stamps from. Well, she said it was your grandfather's company, and he invented a machine to make rubber stamps, a fancy machine called the Ewald machine or something, and Stan was working in it. And I said, well, I remember back when I was even in high school, the Hoff Rubber Stamp Company had a retail store right behind Dayton's on LaSalle Avenue, and I went in there and would pick up my rubber stamps when I ordered them. And I don't remember exactly who was at the counter, but she said, well, you probably bought it from your father. So we had a good laugh over that. So she told me the story of how she met the Hoff family. She was working at the Snyder's drugstore in Minneapolis. She had come there from South Dakota after coming from England because she wanted to, find something else other than living on a sheep ranch where her mother was after marrying Henry, the GI who had a sheep ranch. Her sister Jillian went to Lincoln looking for a husband. Her first boyfriend was gay as well, but then she met Jack and they were married for life. Barbara went to the Twin Cities, stayed at the YWCA for a while, got a job at Snyder's drugstore down on Lake Street just off Hennepin. Then she got an apartment in the neighborhood. So Jerry was one of the co-workers in the store. And one of the clients that came in was Mrs. Laura Hoff, who kind of cruised around in some of the higher society levels of Minneapolis, and she was going to be in a play, and she had to do a British accent. And as Barbara said, she had a horrible American accent, and it was very difficult to teach her this, but Jerry suggested that she invite Barbara out to her house in Edina for elocution lessons to learn how to speak like a Brit. So Barbara would go out there and help her practice with her lines, and Stan, her son, who was about 21 years old at the time, noticed Barbara. Now, Stan had been dating Jeanette since he was 16 or 17 years old, but she was out in Washington State because her sister had had her first baby, and she was helping her for 6 months, so Stan was without a girlfriend. So he figured Barbara could be the fill-in for the summer. So eventually they started dating. By September, Stan was kind of itching to, go beyond second and third base. And so Barbara, you know, agreed and said, well, should I get some protection from the drugstore? And Stan pulled up his shirt and pointed to a scar and said, oh no, the doctor fixed me. Well, later on, Jeanette, whom he married, who was an RN, told me that was his scar from his ruptured appendix. He'd never had a vasectomy, but, you know, that's what he said. And maybe I put that in her mind and his mind because I needed to be born from these two people. So I might have been floating around in the ethers directing a lot of this stuff, you know. She even told me when she came to Minneapolis, she was in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and had to change trains, and that was where she could go to Lincoln. And somebody came up to her on the platform and talked to her and was charmed by her British accent. And so she said, well, what are you going to do? And she said, well, I don't know if I should go to Minneapolis or Lincoln, you know, start my new life. And the person said, oh, Minneapolis is a wonderful place. And so she made the decision then and there to go to Minneapolis. So there you go. So she does have sex with Stan, and I'm the result, but just 2 or 3 weeks later, she meets Bill, an erudite law student that she just loved his intellect, and they had other things in common. They loved classical music, and they would usher at Northrop Auditorium during the concerts. And so she just fell head over heels with Bill, broke up with Stan, and after 4 months, they got married on New Year's Eve. She wasn't having regular periods, but she hadn't had regular periods. She went and had a rabbit test, which was notoriously inaccurate in the early time of pregnancy. And the doctor said, well, you're anemic and you smoked and, you know, you're just not ovulating, so you can't have periods. Well, 2 weeks after the marriage, I kicked her in the stomach, and I was the reason for no periods. So the rabbit test was now positive. She offered an annulment to Bill. He said, oh no, you know, I'm in love with you too, and we'll work this out. If he was in law school, he'd have to drop out to raise me, and, you know, I wasn't his. And that might be a problem when they had another child, you know, the way they might treat one over the other. So they decided to give me up for adoption. His very conservative parents lived out in Benson, Minnesota. They couldn't find out that she was pregnant, obviously. And so she went through the children's home and had to go to the Booth Hospital, which was on Como Avenue, just around the corner where Randy and my apartment was. So I used to drive by this hospital every day where I was born. They cooked up a ruse with Jillian in Lincoln, Nebraska, that Pat, their mother in South Dakota, had a nervous breakdown, went to live with Jillian for a while. Barbara had to go down and help. And Barbara would write letters to her mother-in-law, mail them to Jillian in Lincoln. She'd post them there back to Benson, Minnesota. And, you know, Mother Endersby thought she was down in Lincoln. So she had me. I was underweight, 5 pounds, 4 ounces, you know, due to her anemia and smoking. And she had to take care of me until I gained my birth weight back. She had to go to a 4th of July picnic out at Benson, Minnesota. And so she had about 3 weeks to get my weight back on. And I guess I finally came back 2 days before the party. She got out of the hospital and, you know, wore a one-piece bathing suit. And she thought for sure her mother-in-law could somehow sniff out that she'd given birth, you know, like a cow and her calf or something. I don't know, but she kept the secret, and the in-laws never found out. So that's the story of how I met Barbara, and she became involved in my life from that point on. You know, my own mother was in the second stages of Alzheimer's and then died just 3.5 years later. So as my mother forgot who I was, my birth mother came into my life, and I enjoyed, you know, meeting Devin and Steve and their son Graham, who was only like 7 years at this time. Now he's, 36 this year, I guess, when his birthday comes around. And Barbara developed some memory problems after her husband died in 2000. This was maybe about 2007. She started having short-term memory loss, but it wasn't the Alzheimer's type. And she eventually sold her house and moved up to San Francisco in an apartment where Devin and Steve lived upstairs, and they, you know, had their first house. So as long as they'd taken the knobs off the stove so she didn't cook, she was able to, live by herself and be home alone during the day while they were at work. But if they wanted to go on vacation, somebody needed to be there during those last 5 years or so. And I would fly up and stay with her, and we'd go out and eat and have a wonderful time. She enjoyed everything in the moment. She loved opera, she loved concerts. She knew it was Verdi or knew it was Beethoven. And an hour later, if you said, well, did you enjoy Beethoven? She said, oh, I always enjoy Beethoven, but she'd forgotten that she'd just been to a concert. But in the long run, how much of a concert can you really enjoy an hour after it's over? You enjoy it right in the present when you're there, feeling the emotion and the waves of the music and the vibration and then the energy of the audience. So she's enjoyed the rest of her life that way, and she died in 2017 at 88. And I was really fortunate to have known her, and of course still know the Rubin family, and we keep up a close correspondence, and hopefully I get to see them sometime in the future too. The next vlog will be more psychic experiences from readings, and then another major one that involved my experiences after my dear Randy died in 1999. Stay tuned.